Hello audience, Mr. Z here. The French Revolution, one of the nation's bloodiest and most iconic events, motivated by numerous factors, but perhaps most significantly by the rigid class system which stifled the advancement of peasants to higher levels of living, along with their absolute exclusion from holding any positions of authority, despite making up the overwhelming majority. With the teachings of the Enlightenment becoming more widespread, the monarchs of divine authority also shrunk, no longer holding the same religious significance it once did. Pair that with an economic crisis brought about by participating in the American Revolution, and you have all the fixings for mass civil unrest. But, let's say that unrest never happens. Seems simple enough, just give the people more authority, possibly by establishing a constitutional monarchy and a people's parliament, right? Well, maybe. And the reason I say that is because such an event did happen in our timeline following the fall of Napoleon during the Bourbon Restoration, in which the monarchy was reinstalled with far more limitations, only to be overthrown yet again, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The first by Napoleon during his return to Paris, the second during the July Revolution, which led to a shift of power from one royal to his cousin, and the third time during the 1848 Revolution, which led to the election of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte as President of the Second Republic of France, only for him to re-establish the French Empire, which lasted until the Franco-Prussian War, which led to the fall of the Second Empire and the establishment of the Third Republic, which fell in World War II and gave rise to the current Fourth Republic that we have today. Of course, with a track record like that, I don't give it very long. So, what we need to ask to prevent this mess of revolution from happening is what was it about the government that pushed the French people to seemingly repeat their mistakes over and over again? What was the consistent goal? The answer: liberalism. Now, this may need a bit of explanation, but it does make sense. Look at the First French Revolution and see what they're fighting for. The people want to eliminate the oppressive upper classes. The restoration of the Bourbons showed us the people were willing to accept the presence of a monarchy so long as they also had equal say in policy, just as the aristocracy. The July Revolution and Revolution of 1848 demonstrated the French's opposition to a thought-progressive party implementing conservative policies. Even the rise of both Napoleon showed the promise of social reforms, rights for the working class, and the establishment of workers' rights to strike and organize, along with public clinics and low-cost housing for workers. So, with that knowledge in tow, it seems the only way for the French Revolution to be avoided would be for France to become progressively and consistently more liberal. Frankly, the place seems so bent on equality, it's amazing the place isn't a communist country by now. Now we just need to establish how this could be set in motion, and it just so happens that in his youth, Louis XVI was a prolific student of Enlightenment ideals, and even made moves to advance France in a more liberal direction. However, time and time again he was shot down by the clergy and aristocracy, which led him to slowly lose motivation in his goals. It was also his faith in the ideals of the Enlightenment which pushed him to support the American Revolution, not solely to spite their rival Britain, but also to encourage the rise of a nation built on Enlightenment ideals. Despite common belief, Louis XVI had the people in mind and sought to liberate them from the shackles of serfdom and tyranny enforced by the aristocracy and clergy. However, despite his best efforts to establish rights for the lower classes, abolishing the death penalty and ending taxes, Louis was still painted as the root of French tyranny and beheaded. So let's change that. Let's say that through aggressive negotiation, consolidation of power from the nobles to the crown, Louis is able to enforce his policies, lift up the lower class, and end countless outrages before they ever happened. Public humanities are established and the French Revolution is averted. However, this doesn't come cleanly for the nation either. Not only is France in a financial situation following the American Revolution, but the disgruntled nobles now hold a grudge against the king, and unless something is done, it's only a matter of time until they act upon it. Immediately, Louis would reach out to the newly founded United States for a policy of mutual aid, and it would be through this that France would become the US's primary trade partner. However, under the condition that the French-US relationship was purely business and would not entail military aid, especially in French-British conflicts. However, as both nations build their strength and confidence, this policy may soon change. Off the bat, this already has tremendous repercussions for Europe and the world over. This means no rise of Napoleon, which means no Napoleonic Wars, no Napoleonic Codes, or the unification of Italy and Germany. Communism would likely be overshadowed by the more moderate strain of liberal progressivism. This, along with the unlikelihood of World War I, also means no Russian Revolution, no World War II, and no Cold War. As a matter of fact, Europe doesn't even go the path of unification or collaboration in this timeline, as there's no Napoleon, and thus no great threat to collaborate against. Instead, we'd see the continual rivalry of Enlightenment ideals with feudal imperialist ideals. So, with that said, let's see how much farther this rabbit hole takes us. No French Revolution would leave France with one of the highest populations in all of Europe, and a hard focus on Enlightenment principles, also becoming one of, if not the most left-wing nations in all of Europe. France and the US would develop a relationship based upon their adherence to the principles of the Enlightenment, however will begin to diverge with their interpretations of said principles. This may degrade the relationship slightly, but overall the two would still become quite close. Eventually, in a bid to end their financial situation cleanly, King Louis proposes the sale of the Louisiana Territory to the US, likely for a higher sum than Napoleon, but given the state of Franco-American relations, this shouldn't be too much of a problem. Once the French economy was firmly stabilized, France would begin to seek a reliable military ally, and pushes would be made for a closer union with Spain, who, because Napoleon never rises to power, is able to industrialize much faster and compete with the British ally of Portugal. The two Bourbon kingdoms of Spain and France would band together against their common enemy of Britain, who was attempting to mend relations with Austria, who was at a time a close partner of Britain's, but the relationship soured because Britain had made pushes for a more democratic state, while Austria sought to remain autocratic. This in itself leads to an interesting conflict of interest situation. See, ideologically, Britain has more in common with the French and American policies. However, politically, France doesn't get along well with Britain, but does have an alliance with Austria, who falls on the ideological opposite side of France at this point, and has in the past considered betraying France to side with Britain, notably during the American Revolution. The question then becomes a matter of who would Austria end up siding with, and in all likelihood it would not be with France, but against Prussia, who had a history of aligning itself with Britain and was seemingly preparing for military action against Austria, something which we could have seen in our timeline but had been sort of halted by the Napoleonic Wars. Across the Atlantic, it also just so happens that conflicts are about to erupt between another French ally and a British ally, one which may very well serve into the French favor. Britain had been harassing US ships and even capturing their sailors for recruitment into the British Army, severely undermining American sovereignty and leading many warhawks to call for military retaliation in the form of an invasion of Canada. In our timeline, this would become known as the War of 1812. However, without Napoleon, the stage is a bit different. Britain isn't preoccupied combating France, and thus would be able to mount a far heavier assault. As such, the US would need to reach out to France and its allies for support in the liberation of Canada, encouraging France to act on behalf of the ethnic French people forced to live under the crown of their rivals' state. And with all those pieces in play, war would soon erupt between France, Britain, and their allies, the French against the British, Spain against Portugal, Austria against Prussia, and the US against Canada. Spain with French aid would launch a campaign similar to the 1807 invasion, however it would be met with far more force as the kingdom would have much more time to prepare, yet still would succumb to the Spanish invasion. Meanwhile, Austria and Prussia seem locked in something of a stalemate, with influence from their allies really being the turning tide of the battle. The US is able to mount a greater push against Canada without British intervention, and with the collaborative effort of French separatists within the nation. Finally, France and Britain are also locked within a stalemate scenario, only really able to change the tide of war by supplementing their allies, but unable to get the upper hand over one another. Finally, a proposition is made for a combined fleet to lead an invasion of Ireland as a prelude to an invasion of the British Isles, something Britain would meet with the establishment of fortified sea bunkers and barges, while a naval blockade prepares for the French assault. However, even if Britain held off the French invasion, which it certainly could have, this would have cut it off from its allies in Canada and Prussia, leading the two nations to surrender and leaving Britain alone and outnumbered. Britain would likely be forced to surrender, thus leaving a large majority of Europe under French influence. Essentially, France maintains much of the territory Napoleon would have conquered in our timeline and manages to hold on to it, with the inclusion of French Quebec, while the remainder of Canada falls to the United States. Austria also goes on to become the dominant force in Germanic Europe, while Portugal seeks assimilation into Spain, who itself may be assimilated into France. And that is where I'm going to end today's video. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.